Today I want to talk about something that I believe is the most important geopolitical and economic showdown happening in the world right now. It is not the ongoing tariff wars. It is not the daily political rhetoric coming out of Washington. And it is not the superficial cable news debate about whether Donald Trump and Mark Carney get along. The most important question is this: why is the United States suddenly pushing so desperately for unprecedented control over sovereign Canadian ports? And why did Canada just risk the stability of the entire North American economy to say absolutely not? And the answer, when you look at it carefully, is deeply unsettling. The United States is running out of leverage. It cannot secure its own failing supply chains. It cannot dictate absolute terms to its closest ally, and it cannot absorb the massive economic shockwave that this miscalculation has just triggered. And today I want to explain exactly why, step by step, in simple, easy to understand English. So let's begin. To understand what is happening right now with this port control demand, we have to understand the underlying law of economic empires. Historically, when a superpower faces intense domestic pressure, when its own internal systems begin to bottleneck and fail, it does not look inward, it looks outward. It attempts to absorb the infrastructure of its neighbors. Think about the British Empire in the late 19th century, when their global trade routes were threatened. They did not just negotiate, they took financial and operational control of the Suez Canal in 1875. Why? Because control of the physical choke point is control of the economy. And the nation that controls the port controls the prices, the timing, and the ultimate survival of the goods flowing through. Right now, the United States is facing a quiet, terrifying reality. American ports are overloaded, under-automated, and vulnerable to immense labor disruptions. The U.S. supply chain is bleeding, so Washington looked north. They demanded what they are calling joint operational oversight, effectively demanding that the U.S. dictates customs, security, and priority routing at deep-water Canadian ports like Vancouver and Prince Rupert. They want to treat Canadian sovereign territory as an overflow parking lot for the American economy. But Prime Minister Mark Carney, armed with a new majority government and a mandate to push back against Washington, just categorically rejected the demand. Now, on the surface, some might say this is just a standard negotiation. The US asks for a lot, Canada says no, and they meet in the middle. But here's why that thinking completely misreads the situation. This is not a negotiation. This is a structural collision. But here is what makes this demand for Canadian port control even more complicated, more dangerous, and more unprecedented than any historical parallel. So let's imagine that the United States decides to force the issue. And let's imagine Washington decides that it will punish Canada for saying no. This is where the architecture of the North American economy becomes a weapon that fires backward. Because when you try to punish a deeply integrated trading partner, you trigger a chain reaction. Let me walk you through exactly how this plays out. Step 1. The US follows through on its threat and weaponizes the border. To punish Canada for refusing port control, Washington implements agonizingly slow security inspections on all Canadian freight trains and trucks crossing into the United States. Step 2. The border effectively freezes. The Ambassador Bridge alone, the crossing between Detroit and Windsor, handles roughly $360 million worth of goods every single day. That stops the trucks back up for miles. Step 3. This is where the damage jumps the border. You see, the modern economy operates on something called just-in-time manufacturing. This means factories do not keep giant warehouses of spare parts. They rely on trucks arriving exactly when the part is needed. Step 4. American factories begin to shut down. An auto plant in Michigan suddenly realizes it cannot finish building a pickup truck because a specific microchip or a transmission component is sitting in a stalled truck in Ontario. The workers in Ohio, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania are sent home. Step 5. The U.S. economy takes the exact hit it was trying to avoid. Consumer prices skyrocket because supply plummets, retailers panic. The cost of living surges in the American Midwest, driven entirely by a policy designed in Washington. The United States is trapped. It cannot advance its aggressive demands without freezing the border. It cannot freeze the border without destroying its own manufacturing base. It cannot destroy its own manufacturing base without causing domestic political catastrophe. And that is why Mark Carney could reject the demand. He knows the math. He knows that the American economy relies on Canadian integration just as heavily as Canada relies on the US. This is why the US cannot simply force compliance through brute economic force. This is the trap. Now let me tell you what happens if the US chooses the other option, because this is the part no one is talking about. So let's look at the alternative. Let's imagine the US administration realizes the economic danger and decides to back down. They drop the demand for port control to save their own auto industry and keep the trucks moving. Now, on the surface, this sounds like the rational choice, but it triggers a completely different, much darker geopolitical nightmare for Washington. To understand this, we have to look at the psychology of the current US administration and the concept of global perception. The entire political brand of Washington right now is built on absolute dominance. The philosophy of America first requires that America always dictates the final terms. If the United States publicly demands control over Canadian infrastructure, and Canada simply says no, and then the United States walks away quietly, what message does that send to the rest of the world? If Washington cannot enforce its will on Ottawa, how can it enforce its will on Beijing? How can it enforce its will in the Strait of Hormuz? This creates a phenomenon we call mission creep. Mission creep is when a government commits a small amount of political capital to a demand, meets resistance, and instead of backing down, it pours more and more capital in just to save face. Think about the Vietnam War. In 1961, the US had sent roughly 3,200 military advisors to Vietnam. By 1968, the US had over 500,000 troops on the ground. Why? Because leaving looked like weakness. That is the sunk cost fallacy. And it is one of the most powerful and dangerous forces in human decision-making. The US has anchored its reputation to this port demand. If it backs down, the illusion of absolute hegemony shatters. The US is carrying over $39 trillion in national debt. Its power globally is held together not just by the military, but by the perception that the US dollar and US authority is untouchable. If Mark Carney can stare down the White House and win, the spell is broken. The world realizes that Giant is constrained by its own supply chains, so the US cannot back down. But as we just established, it also cannot push forward without wrecking its own economy. It cannot advance. It cannot retreat. It cannot stay where it is. But here is where things get really serious for the global economy. Because the reason the US wants these ports is not what you think it is. And now, I want to tell you something that most mainstream media is completely hiding from you. When you watch the news tonight, you will hear pundits argue that this is a dispute about tariffs, or trucking regulations, or border security. It is not. The United States is demanding control of Canadian deepwater ports because the Pentagon and the US Commerce Department know that a massive global maritime crisis is coming, and they are trying to build a walled fortress in North America before the storm hits. Let me say that again. The US is moving to annex Canadian infrastructure because Washington is quietly preparing for the collapse of global shipping lanes. Right now, look at what is happening around the world. In the Middle East, the US Navy is attempting to blockade the Strait of Hormuz to pressure Iran. That single waterway has historically been responsible for 20% of the world's global oil shipping. The Pacific is highly militarized. The Panama Canal is facing severe drought restrictions, drastically limiting the number of massive cargo ships that can cross between the oceans. The arteries of global trade are hardening. They are choking. The United States looks at this map and realizes its own West Coast ports, like Los Angeles and Long Beach, are not resilient enough to handle a world where shipping routes are violently disrupted and cargo must be rerouted at a moment's notice. Canadian ports like Prince Rupert in British Columbia are actually closer to Asia than Los Angeles is. They are deep, they are efficient, and they connect directly into the North American rail network. The hidden truth is that Washington is not trying to punish Canada. Washington is panicking. They are demanding control of these ports to ensure that when global supply chains inevitably snap, the US government has the ultimate authority to prioritize American goods, American oil, and American military logistics over Canadian domestic needs. They want the legal right to say, our emergency supersedes your sovereignty. And Mark Carney knows this. He knows that giving the US control of Canadian ports means Canada will be the first one thrown off the life raft when the economic ship starts sinking. And that is where the trap of global interconnectedness finally snaps shut. This port dispute does not exist in isolation. It is connected to everything else happening in the world right now. When you push your allies to the brink, when you demand absolute control rather than mutual cooperation, you do not create security, you create fragility. The US economy is taking a hit right now not because Canada is being unreasonable, but because the US strategy of maximum pressure is finally meeting the physical limits of reality. You cannot bully a supply chain into existence. You cannot tariff your way out of a logistical bottleneck. There's only one viable path forward for the United States, and it is a path that requires immense political courage. Washington must abandon the illusion of absolute dominance and return to the framework of deeply integrated, respectful partnership. The US must realize that a strong, sovereign, economically independent Canada is actually the greatest strategic asset America has. If North America is going to survive the coming global supply chain fractures, it must do so as an alliance of equals. The US must negotiate to upgrade North American infrastructure cooperatively, sharing costs and sharing jurisdiction. That is not a weakness. That is strategic preservation. And that is how you survive the 21st century. Whether the current leadership in Washington has the humility and the foresight to take that path. That is the most important question of our time. And honestly, I don't know the answer. So let us quickly summarize exactly what we have covered today, because the pieces are moving fast. The demand, the US is pushing for control over Canadian ports because its own infrastructure is vulnerable, which leads to a direct assault on Canadian sovereignty. The first trap. The US cannot force Canada into submission through border slowdowns, because weaponizing the border immediately crashes the US auto and manufacturing sectors. The second trap. The US cannot simply back down, because the sunk cost fallacy and the demands of America First politics mean that retreating looks like global weakness. The hidden truth. This is not a localized trade dispute. This is Washington quietly preparing for the breakdown of global maritime trade by attempting to turn North America into a locked-down fortress. If you want to understand the real forces driving global economics, free from the noise of mainstream media, subscribe to the channel. I break these complex issues down in simple English every single week. But now I want to turn it over to you. Tell me in the comments, do you think Canada will be able to withstand the economic pressure from Washington, or will they eventually be forced to hand over control of their ports? Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.